Hi everyone, welcome to another version of Foresight's Intelligent Cooperation Group. I'm really happy to see so many of you here so early, I think, and hope it will be useful and valuable for you to have gotten up that early. All right, so today we are going to be joined by Robert Axelrod to discuss the topic of political polarization with a new agent-based model that he'd love to discuss with you. So I think to contextualize the meeting a little bit with the theme of the group and of the book. I mean, I think as many of you are aware, Robert Axelrod has started the Axelrod tournaments, which was really pretty groundbreaking work that led to much of the understanding of cooperation that we have today. And then he deepened much of those insights in the book, The Evolution of Cooperation, which many of you, I think, even have right now in front of you. So his work is generally really foundational for the theme of the book on intelligent voluntary cooperation. However, recently he has put his mind to understanding political polarization in general, and this is especially relevant for the chapter 2 that we shared with you earlier in the session where Mark Miller and Robin Hanson discussed value drift and value diversity. And so in the chapter and in the last session, we make the claim that values are very diverse across civilization and likely will drift further over time and also further apart out of each other between different agents in civilization. So really looking forward to seeing whether that holds true in this talk on political polarization in general today. And then hopefully also in the discussion focus specifically about how Robert's insights can influence many of the social systems that many of you are working on, such as decentralized social media, but really any type of cooperative system, whether it's smart contracts or else. I think all of those are probably going to benefit from his insights today. So really excited for the talk. And yeah, without further ado, Robert, we're very grateful that you're making the time to join us today. Thank you very much for joining.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's an exciting opportunity and a very interesting group. So a major problem with cooperation today is the fact that our society and many others are so deeply polarized that makes cooperation difficult. And so I've been studying the process of political polarization with two of my colleagues, Josh Demuth, who's a postdoc at Arizona State, and Stephanie Forrest, a computer scientist at Arizona State. Let's see. So the motivations for this study are to ask, is there a level of ideological polarization above which it feeds upon itself in a runaway process? And also, what can you do about it? So the premise of our study is that there's already ideological polarization among the elites in the United States. Among the both public and elites, there's something called affective polarization. Ideological is where your views on policies differ, and affective is where you hate the other person or you love the other one. And so the two political parties have a lot of a polarization of affect. In other words, each one really has a lot of emotional either attachment to their own or rejection of the other. So because there's so much affective polarization in there's already ideological polarization among the elites, there's a great potential for ideological polarization among the public as well. And that's what we're studying here. So we developed a very simple model. This is to study this process. This is an agent-based model, which differs from the more classic modeling techniques using equations like differential equations. Agent-based modeling is where you represent individuals as actors who interact with each other according to specific rules. And then you do a simulation of the history that develops in order to study the implications of the assumptions. This is very useful for situations where there's so much interaction, nonlinear effects that you can't solve equation-based representation, but you can do the simulation, and that's what we're doing here. we call it the attraction repulsion model. So it's an agent-based model with policy dimensions. Today, we're only going to talk about one dimension. For example, you could think about it as left, right, or liberal conservatives. So the actors or the individuals have positions ranging from 0 to 1. And the informal statement of the model is very simple. It's actors tend to be exposed to views similar to their own. They're more likely to hear somebody that has similar views than somebody that has quite different views. That's the first premise, first axiom. And the second is that interaction between similar actors reduces their difference. You tend to be attracted to those with similar views when you interact with them. But if they're dissimilar, you tend to increase your difference. You're repulsed by views that are not similar to your own. So here's how this works. An exposure, here's the formal formulation. If two agents are d apart, the probability of interaction depends on the gradient of exposure. So here's an example where the probability that these two actors will interact depends on the half-life of this exposure. You might imagine it as a decay rate. And so in this case, if the parameter is 0.1, then if they're 0.1 apart, there's a 50% chance. That's why we call it H for halving distance. And if they're much further apart, let's say 0.4, then they have a much less chance of being exposed either one to the other. So that's the exposure idea. And then the second rule is about attraction and repulsion. So the attraction depends on tolerance. And the idea is that if you interact with somebody that is within your tolerance range, you find that attractive and you move toward it. You interact with somebody beyond your tolerance range, then you're repulsed by that and you move away from it. And the extent of the movement is governed by a parameter we call movement, M for movement. Let's call it responsiveness. Is the fraction of the distance you move towards or away from the other. So for example, if A is attracted to B, that's within their tolerance range of 0.25. And so it moves to a quarter of the way towards that one. And so it moves, so A will move further a little bit to the right toward B. So that's how the attraction works. And the repulsion is if you interact with somebody much further away, for example, if B in the middle here interacts with C, that's further beyond its tolerance range of 0.25, then it's repulsed and it moves that fraction away. And so it actually winds up, I'm sorry, let's look at it from the point of view of actor C. C is interacting with B, and so C is repulsed by B because it's too far away for its tolerance. And so it moves away from B, and in fact, it'll move as far as away as it can, which brings it to 0.1. So that's how repulsion works. Boing! And here are the parameters of the simulation. We do 100 actors. We have a initial distribution is a normal distribution with a mean in the middle and a standard deviation of 0.2. A tolerance is the, I'm sorry, I'm going to come back to that in a second. Yeah. The tolerance and responsiveness are the values I just mentioned, and the gradient of exposure evaluates how likely you are to view distant things. And then the main measure of polarization that we're using is just the variance of the population. How spread out is it? So here's a movie that's going to show you the situation where here's the dimension and here's the initial distribution realized with the mean of 0.5 and a standard deviation of 0.2. And here there's a number of agents so that they're spread out here, but there's it's a bell-shaped curve with 100 agents. So what happens now when the tolerance is at 0.25? And here's what happens over time. So you see what happened. A lot of folks are converged toward the center, but there's some extremists at both ends. And the extremists grow, the proportion grows larger and larger over time. In fact, eventually, there's nobody left except the extremists. So this is an example of complete polarization. It starts with a normal distribution. Oops, let me go back to starts with normal distribution. The first thing that happens, as you saw, is that a lot of people converge toward the center. I'll stop it here. But there's a few people that become repulsed towards are repulsed from all this. Maybe they started here and then they move further away. And some are repulsed in the other direction. And then over time, more and more people get repulsed. The center forms, but it doesn't hold. And eventually it just disappears completely as everybody gets polarized. Boing. So that's an interesting implication of a very simple model with just these two basic rules. Whoops. Okay, now, here I want to compare two levels of tolerance. The first across here is time, and this is what you've just seen in the movie. It starts here, then the center forms, but the center does not hold, and eventually you get complete polarization. That's what the movie showed. But here's a comparable stills from another movie where there's more tolerance, 0.35. So it starts the same way. Whoops, I'm sorry. It starts the same way, and the center forms. But when there's tolerance a little bit greater than the ones in the movie, the center actually holds, and there's very few people at the extremes. And so the level of tolerance really makes a difference. And here's a display of various levels of tolerance over time. The 0.25 is what we saw in the movie. So eventually it becomes completely polarized. The maximum variance in one dimension is 0.25, when everybody's at one extreme or the other. If the tolerance is lower than that, it polarizes, but at this 3.5, which is what I just showed you as this bottom set of pictures in the previous slide, here it does not polarize. The center does hold. And so there's a sensitivity here on the tolerance level as to whether polarization will occur or not. And this is a display that shows tolerance as a function of movement. How responsive is the population? So the A and B is what we just saw in those two things. A is when it was tolerance is 0.25 and the movement was a quarter, which is our basic thing. And then I showed you this other one. And what you could see over here is the scale of variance, meaning that if it's low variance, the center holds, and if it's high variance, the center does not. And you could see it's not quite a phase transition, but there's a clear boundary that mostly depends on the level of tolerance, but also it's affected by how fast the movement goes, how much, how responsive it is to a single message. Now here's another idea that we tried, which is, imagine that once in a while, an actor is attracted to the position they originally started at. For example, you might imagine their starting position representing their economic self-interest, such as if they're not very well off, they might be a little bit on the left. Their economic self-interest might favor government spending for social safety net. If they're very well off, they might want lower taxes and be on the right side of the scale. And so this takes the idea that every once in a while, people really pay are attracted back to where they started in their economic self-interest, or it could be which elites they're listening to. There's various interpretations of their initial position. So this is again over time, and this again is variance. And so they start, we're going to study various levels of paying attention to your initial position. Whoops. Yeah. This is the, they all start with, no matter how much self-interest attentiveness there is, the same way we saw before. And these lines show different degrees of attention to your economic self-interest. This line is what we've seen, is sort of our base common thing, which is you don't pay attention at all. That was what we saw before. But here, if you just pay attention 1% of the time, not very often, but once in a while, you are attracted back to your original position. This is really frustrating. Once in a while, you're attracted back to your initial position. Means that you could actually get two clusters, quite a bit of polarization in two different places, but not necessarily at the extreme. And then if you, even 10% of the time you attend, you completely eliminate the almost completely eliminate the polarization, and the center does hold. And so even a little bit of attentiveness to your original position or self-interest is enough to prevent polarization. The next thing we looked at is introducing shock. So suppose there's an external situation that affects everybody. For example, war might make everybody more willing to have government spending, or a recession affects everybody, and maybe even climate change or an epidemic would affect everybody moving in the same direction, let's say to the right. So here's a study of a shock, which is moving everybody to the right before, and this was the situation we saw before, where there's a center, but it's not complete. If you move if after the shock, and this is a function of how often you pay attention. So this is not paying attention just 10%, 40%, or 80%. And at 10%, you could get you still can get complete polarization eventually. And likewise at 40%. And but here it's very lopsided. Everybody moves to the right. And curiously enough, there's extremists on the left, even though the shock meant that everybody moves to the right. But what happens then is that some people are repulsed by those folks that have moved to the right, and they move to the left and stay there because they're very unlikely to pay attention to these people. And if they do, they're repulsed by them and they don't get any closer. If they're attend to somebody on their own side, they stay there too. So it's very stable. So here's the summary. How to prevent polarization. One, if you have high tolerance, that leads to consensus. But we saw it's really quite sensitive to the level of tolerance. If there's a high gradient of exposure, that means you're much more likely to be exposed to similar views than dissimilar views. Then what you get is insulated communities. Everybody is attending to their own group, and you could get several different clusters be stable. But that could prevent polarization as well, but also makes for isolation. As we saw, if there's just a little attention to self-interest, and maybe even 1 or 10%, you could move back to a preferred moderate position, and that's another way of preventing polarization. And finally, if there's very early or very strong external shock, you can get a consensus. So some future possibilities for research, you can add elites, you can add affective polarization where the parties are repulsed by members of the other party. You can have elections where the primary elections are based on a median of their party followers, and then they have candidates, and then you play the same game. So you can add a lot of things without complicating the model very much. And here's a surprising takeaway and my conclusion. is it's one of those things that's obvious after you say it. And namely, if a population isn't very tolerant, then more exposure to different ideas will increase polarization. You might think exposure to different ideas decreases, but if you're not very tolerant, then you're repulsed by all that exposure to different ideas. So that is the summary of the article that we're doing, and it's part of a project of having about a dozen papers to be a special issue of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And each of the articles, all about polarization, and each of the articles will be authored by at least one social scientist and at least one computer scientist. So they're getting social scientists and computer scientists, as in this project, and they're going to have a dozen of these published hopefully over the summer. And we're entering the final stage. So it's still time for me to absorb and be influenced by your attractive comments. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Wow. Okay, that's a lot to digest. But I from the chat, I gather that many people have been doing so already. So thank you so much for sharing that upfront with us. We have a few questions. Would you be willing to take them? All right, I'll start ahead with David Monheim.
Hi, this is great. I've seen other literature on agent-based rational actor models that kind of are more specifically intended to be predictive. What I was thinking about this is that it seems more like a model that has the individuals updating about trustworthiness rather than updating about factual issues. And so I had said in the chat that it seems a lot like E.T. James has an example of how getting identical evidence can lead to divergence of views, even for rational Bayesians. And it seems like the model is showing something like that, where the kind of two groups are getting effectively identical evidence about what it is that everyone believes and then updating.
Well, in this model, people are not exposed uniformly to where others are. They don't see the whole population. And in fact, according to the first rule, they're much more, each one is much more likely to be exposed to similar views. So it's not a matter of everybody having the same information moving to different conclusions. They actually have a biased sort of sampling based on similar views.
David, do you want to
just point out that, and emphasize that this kind of model is not meant to be predictive. It's meant to help you understand some implications of underlying assumptions. So it's meant for insight rather than prediction.
All right, thank you. Robert, before I take the next question, would you prefer us to have this bit recorded or not? Would it be useful for you to have the comments recorded, or do you prefer this to be off the record?
Yes, please do. Thank you.
Okay, good. So then just making sure that everyone else, apart from after here, knows that their comments are recorded, as was the presentation too. Okay, David Friedman, you're next, and perhaps say 1 or 2 words about your background, such in case Robert doesn't know, so he has some context. David, are you able to unmute? Otherwise, perhaps we can go with Chris Lemmer-Weber first, and then I'll talk to you. Oh, there you are.
Now? Yeah. Suppose you add in geographical dispersion so that you're more likely to interact with your neighbors, and some neighborhoods are farther left or right than other neighborhoods. That's going to affect it. And if you now bring in the internet, suddenly everybody's a neighbor of everyone. And since one of the things that we've seen is changes in the political structure during the same period when the internet was coming in, it would be interesting to see how your model suggests the effects of that would be.
Right. previously I've done a number of models that have agents represented on a grid, and they tend to interact with their geographically local. But as you say, in this world of social media, distance doesn't matter, and that's why we've focused on it this time. But yes, if you can go back and easily look at the adding a part of the exposure relating to you're more exposed to people close to you in space as well as close to you in ideology.
But what I'm thinking of is, what if you start there and then shift to the other and see how the outcome changes?
Yeah, that'd be cool. Yeah, well, you reduce the effective geography and see what difference it makes. And as you say, you might start with not randomly placed geography, but say north and south having different views. That's cool. Thanks.
All right, great, lovely. Next one up, we have Alan Karp, Chris Webber, and then John Chisholm is literally raising his hand. Alan, yes, great.
Yeah, I'm Alan Karp. I have a PhD in astronomy, but I quickly discovered I like playing with computers more than the stars. And done a whole bunch of different things, including some computer security, and a little bit of game theory. So I question the assumption that exposure to views of the other side is always repulsive. I attend a lot of random seminars, and one did a simulation similar to this, and then showed that bubbles increase the polarization, and that adding, I believe, something like 20% links between views actually left something in the middle. There was still a lot of polarization, but left something in the middle. And I'm just wondering if your model, if you've looked at that in your models.
We don't. Many of the other models in this series do consider network effects where linkages become more or less common as they interact with each other. And we've taken the simplified view that that interaction is a function of distance and not, for example, experience with a specific agent. But the idea that exposure to quite different views is not always repulsive is certainly an interesting one, and there's a lot of research on this in various sociology experiments. And one of the common themes of that research is that it's really very hard to persuade people by presenting arguments that are different from their own beliefs. And in fact, you often get a boomerang effect, which is, well, if, for example, if somebody doesn't believe in climate change and then you give them evidence about the melting glaciers and all that, and sometimes with people that don't believe in it will say, well, if that's the best evidence you have, then I really don't believe it.
Yeah, this is a different matter of simply putting on their news feeds news items that would only appear in someone else's news feed. No convincing tried. And another follow-up question was, these are experiments that could be done on Facebook, say,
right,
by tweaking the algorithm on a small percentage of the population.
Yeah.
So all of those experiments?
Yes, there have been a number of those of controlling the sources by which people that people are exposed to.
At scale?
Yeah.
At scale like Facebook?
I'm sorry?
At scale like Facebook could do.
Well, they usually do it by getting volunteers, maybe 2,000, and showing them different things. And then
but that biases because they volunteered. Facebook can do it purely at random.
Right, but then, yes, but then you need to have a mechanism to control what they're exposed to.
Absolutely. I just wondered if experiments have been tried.
All right.
Well, you might say that advertising campaigns and various other campaigns do alpha beta tests, experiments by which they try to expose people based on what they've done before.
Okay, but I just thought with your.
All right, lovely. Next one. Okay, I'll take the next comment for now, and then maybe we can get back to you, okay? For now, we will have Chris Weber next.
Hi, so I work on social media systems design, so I'm very interested in your research to figure out how we can screw people up less. One thing that struck me significantly is that Twitter appears to have a structure in which there is a high gradient of exposure, and that there's, in fact, a large amount of context collapse. There's lots of information that you can get from many different sources at once. On the other hand, you also get a very curated experience. But it strikes me that even when, what we have also seen occur, and it's not just in Twitter, it's in the increasing amount of systems that we've seen roll out, is a lack of safety in terms of being able to explore ideas. So this, and I wonder whether or not you feel this is accounted for in your model. So for example, you know, a lot of communication that I see on my social networking seems to be identifying whether or not you're taking the same posture as your peers. And if you're not, that's a way to be opened up for attack, right? And the places where I might be able to explore new ideas would be in places where I feel it's safe for me to explore different postures. Ironically, in that kind of system, that's more likely to happen in closed off spaces rather than kind of wide open spaces, it seems. So I wonder, do you think that that's already accounted for in your structure? And if it isn't, what could we do? And as somebody who's trying to design social network systems, what would you tell me to do so as to not screw up my users as much?
Well, in the context of the model as it stands, if you want to move people, you should expose them to views that are within their tolerance range, but in the direction that you want to move them. And so the idea would be to do this incrementally. Don't expose them to something that they'll be repulsed by, but expose them to something that's similar enough that they'll find it attractive, and then move, and then that'll actually move in that direction. And then that would be a notion of a safe space that where you're only exposed to things that you tolerate.
Chris, has that answered your question? Then we'd be moving on to John.
I think what it indicates is that I might be thinking of a component that I'm not sure was captured in your response, which is that it's not just the types of information that I'm considering, but in the environment in which I end up considering them, right? So it's not just that I'm being exposed to certain ideas, but am I considering them in an environment where I believe I can actually consider them and test changing my views without condemnation or exclusion from the peers I value?
What does it mean to test your ideas?
Well, I mean, if you pose something to me, such as, you know, we ought to be, you know, this, if we continue with this type of structure, you're going to end up with, you know, destabilization. And maybe I previously thought I had to participate with other people like me, right? You know, if I want to test that, do I risk, if I said, actually, this person's right, I'm going to go off in this type of direction. So actually, I might be screwing it up by giving, let's take another approach, right? So let the climate change one you gave earlier, right? If I'd like to test thinking about whether or not climate change is real, and somebody is giving me some information that might be potentially convincing, but if I want to talk about and think through whether or not it's convincing, is there a risk if I express it? Will I end up excluded from a group of people that I value?
I see. Well, in the context of the model, if you're too far away from the people you value, they'll be repulsed by your ideas.
Mm-hmm.
and therefore it's not safe. But if you move in one direction within their tolerance range, you could pull them off in that direction.
Okay, so if you could create a temporary space in which to be able to limit the participants, in which they could have a temporary amount of experimentation with their thoughts, would that help be able to reduce the fear of repulsion issue? Because then the repulsion risks are not permanent, potentially.
That's an interesting idea. If you could develop that into an experiment to try it out. Another approach suggested by the model is that you ask people to temporarily be more tolerant. In other words, take seriously ideas that are borderline between what you find acceptable and what you find repulsive, and sort of try to get people to expand their tolerance somewhat and see if that can help.
Yeah, unfortunately, my view from looking at my feed is that people will get mad at me for taking that type of position because they feel that I'm betraying my peer group, right? By doing such a thing. So it feels like you almost have to construct a different environment in order to be able to do such a thing, but I'm not sure. So, but I think that your model is you're right. I think that the way of looking at the repulsion thing at least possibly explains why we result in that circumstance. So I think it's good. I won't take up any more time. Thank you.
Let me just say that we have a draft that I could send anybody that is interested in seeing it.
I'm very interested. I could type my email in the chat if that helps.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll make sure to coordinate this bit as well. Okay, John, we have you next. John Chisholm. Trying to unmute, I see. Okay, great.
Sorry about that. Bob, it's a thrill to see your lifetime of research now focused on addressing this all-important issue of polarization. So just thrilled by that. I'm a trustee of Santa Fe Institute and MIT, so I know Stephanie Forrest through that connection, the first SFI. And it's about higher education. I'd like to ask you, because it seems to me they may well be part of the culprit of growing polarization. It seems to me higher education, universities should, more than any other institutions I can think of, model open discussion and tolerance to avert the outcomes you've been talking about. And yet, if you look at MIT's undergraduate population, I've just uploaded to the chat a chart which shows how one-sided the undergraduate population is from blue states as opposed to red states. 38% of MIT's undergraduate population comes from red states, and many of these, that's per capita, adjusting for state populations. The rate of enrollment of students from red states is only at 38%, that for blue states. And many of those students from red states are from blue cities in those states, so that it's even more skewed than it would seem from the 38%. And that's at MIT, which is, as you know, a science and engineering university as opposed to a liberal arts university. And I'm sure that the skewness is much heavier elsewhere. And so there's no significant constituency, center-right constituency on campus, it seems to me, through which left and right, red and blue might hear each other out, consider each other's views, and find common ground, which it seems to me would be an essential dynamic to keep polarization from happening. What do you think, what are your thoughts on all of this?
Well, first, I'm a liberal, and I think that it's a good thing that many undergraduates tend on the liberal side, just to present my bias and perspective. I think there is a danger, however, of people being intolerant and unwilling to listen to divergent views. And that's a serious problem when people, for example, on the right in college feel that they're shut up when they make a point in their class discussion. They're not listened to and they're not respected and not taken seriously. That's really a serious problem. And I think that the faculty should take responsibility for managing those discussions and saying to somebody who disrespects a different view to say, listen, we have to take each other seriously. We have to pay attention. We have to confront the issues and not be ad hominem and not reject something out of hand. There's some of a problem on the other side where, let's say, ethnic minorities sometimes feel that they're dismissed, that their experiences are not taken seriously. And again, I think that it's incumbent upon the faculty to not only model, but to direct the conversation, to say that it's your responsibility as a student to listen to each other with respect and pay attention and respond to it and not dismiss it because of who they are, where they're coming from, or whether their views are different from yours. But I don't think that just to repeat the beginning, I don't think it's necessarily a problem that undergraduates tend to be more liberal than conservative. In fact, I think that's a hopeful sign to me.
It's opening up another box. All right, great. Next one up, we have Kate Sills with a question.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm a software engineer, and my question has to do with software. I'm wondering if the software for the agent-based model is publicly accessible.
Yes, it will be. We're not. Yeah, we'll have when we do publish after receiving more comments and changes and maybe some new experiments. Then we'll have supplementary material to the publication that will have the code well documented.
Excellent. And what is it written in?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Josh DeMunda has been the one that manages that. I mean, to me, a long time ago, when I did my own coding, I realized it didn't really matter very much. It was a matter of convenience. For example, which language had the best linkage to good graphics, for example. But we didn't try to optimize speed on this. Just not necessarily, not worth it to bother with that. Rather optimize programmer time.
Oh, there's a contentious viewpoint.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Next one up, we have Mark Miller.
Hi. So actually, I've got several questions I'd like to ask. I'm going to start with in the things that people have opinions about. We've got a tremendously high-dimensional space of different things one could have opinions about. And one of the things that's very weird about observing politics is that even though there's this high-dimensional space of potential opinions, people seem to align along a spectrum, and which spectrum is the things collapse into just seems arbitrary over time and often rotates. It used to be that the right used to be more paranoid about Russia, and the left was more enthused about protectionism, and that's flipped around. So there's no thematic consistency about which things are grouped on a spectrum, but there seems to be some kind of restorative force to keep the opinions organized along the spectrum. So does your model speak to, in a high dimensional space, where people tend to organize in there, and whether it tends to collapse things into a spectrum, and whether there's any sense about what line is chosen through the high dimensional space?
We did a little exploration of multi-dimensional spaces, but the model itself isn't very useful for that, I think. There's a number of others in this group, in this project, that are interested in collapse of dimensions and why a single dimension tends to organize things. And there's a huge political science literature on this set of questions, going back to Madison's idea that democracy will flourish when there are multiple dimensions rather than a single dimension, so that you can compromise and not have a civil war between the two sides. As to why they tend to organize on a largely single dimension, I think there's two fundamental reasons. One is that a lot of issues correlate with left-right, and because of economics, that there's a lot of things about big government versus small government, safety nets versus not safety nets, willingness to have government spending versus wanting lower taxes. There's just a whole range of those. And there's a lot of democracies that the best single dimension really looks like left-right. And it used to be clearer in the United States than it is today, because as you say, it's things have moved around the United States until it's more of an affective than an ideological distinctions. The other reason why things collapse is that when there's a few political parties, or even two, like in the American system, the elites then tend to differ, whatever dimension, whatever vector distinguishes the elites tends to be what the messaging is about, or they criticize the other end of the scale. And so that will tend to collapse dimensions, because then if there's some issue in which they don't agree, which they do agree, they won't talk about that much. And so they'll talk about things they don't agree, and then those tend to then become correlated, because so there's only two parties to push it. So it's both underlying economics and elite messaging.
Hey, very interesting. And one more question. Historically, we've, for most of our history, there's been tremendous polarization and intolerance. For example, different religious groups at war with each other, often on differences in theology that just seem so trivial to us from our age, being things that had people at each other's throats and massive slaughter. And then there was a rise of tolerance, and there's many different historical ways to account for that. But one of them is with the rise of commerce, suddenly your opportunity lay in selling things to other people, which required understanding other people, being able to think about what would be valuable to them. And some of the rise of empathy is attributed to the repeated trade creating an interest in understanding each other. In modern times, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned something about my background. I was part of Project Xanadu, which was a pre-web hypertext system. And one of our big inspirations for why we were so enthusiastic about hypertext was very much inspired by Popper's account of the logic of scientific discovery. And so we were very much, at the time, naively thought that human beings were substantially motivated in their opinion formation by a desire to figure out what the truth of things are. And the thing that we underestimated is the degree to which, for many people, as Robin Hanson puts it, they take on beliefs like they decide what clothes to wear. It's an issue of signaling, among other things, tribal loyalties. And so the issue of social media, one of the one of the ways in which these contrasts can recapitulate is with regard to what people feel is in their interest in repeated interactions with others. And if the nature of the social media is such as to draw people into thinking of their interests as involving at least understanding people that are opposed to them, then that can lead to more of thinking through what something looks like from a different point of view. So the particular thing I want to mention here is prediction markets. In prediction markets, your opportunity is people who disagree with you. So in order to find opportunities, you want to think about markets populated by people who disagree with you, because if you're right and they're wrong, there's an opportunity for profit there. And if you marry discussion with betting and prediction, then you get into conversations. So
I think that's a fascinating point about prediction markets, and also your point about commerce may have led to greater understanding and even tolerance. Let me just add one point about religion. In the West, the 30 Years' War, ending in 1648, ended with a compromise that there'd be local option, that each prince would not try to change the other prince's religion. And that was sort of a fight to the death, which resulted in this mutual tolerance, externally at least. And incidentally, the Muslim societies never had a fight to the death. They're still in the mode of there's a right answer and you'd better hold it or else. Whereas the West had a different experience.
Right, thanks. Mark's nodding, good. Okay, then I'm moving on to David Mannheim again with another comment.
Yeah, I'll introduce myself since I didn't before. My background's in public policy. I did my PhD at Rand, and now I work on a variety of long-termist and large-scale risk questions. My question actually goes back to work that you did probably before I was born about evolution of cooperation. So that work, you basically showed that selfish agents end up deciding to cooperate because it works really well for them. And part of the reason that that happens, kind of not explicitly in the work that you did, but implicitly, is that the feedback cycles are short enough for people to actually like have something happen that matters within the time frame that like there's the ability to decide to do that. Here, one of the things that seems to lead to the divergence of views is that feedback cycles, especially in actual politics, are really long and very kind of diluted. So if you have a country of, let's say, 350 million people, your individual decision about which policies to support kind of gets washed out. So the only thing that matters for which thing that you pick is, you know, what signal it sends, as people had been mentioning, as opposed to the actual practical implication. So my thought was, one of the ways that this would change would be to have people talk about or have opinions about things that had more practical object level implications that they saw in the short term, which I think kind of we've seen that large scale democracies are harder to run than small scale ones. And I think that this kind of feeds into why that would be true.
I think that's a very good point, and it's represented in my book in terms of the discount parameter. So if you have a discount rate of 10% a year, but the interactions occurred monthly, and then there's not much discount. But if the interactions occur decade by decade, then there's a great discount rate. And as you know, if you don't care about the future relative to the present, scaled by how fast the interactions are, then cooperation becomes much more difficult. So it's easy to interpret what you said and as a parameter in my model. And I think, and you're absolutely right. And one advantage of something like a Paris agreement on climate change is that it shortens the interaction time by saying, well, if you cut your coal production by a certain amount, I'll know that within a year. And I don't have to wait for the water level to rise to see whether you're cooperating or not. And so I think that's measurable commitments to do things that have relatively short ability to monitor and confirm are very useful for the reason you said.
Great. Next one up, we have David Friedman again with another point, and Chris Carlson, perhaps we'll get to you, but we are now 3 minutes before closing.
Well, I really appreciate your comments and suggestions. I'll look forward to also to any email you send me and to the checking out the chat, of which there seems to be many messages there waiting.
I had a point related to my previous point, but which might cut in the opposite direction. And that is that one of the things that affects who you talk to is whether you have interests in common aside from politics.
Yeah.
That probably stamp collectors talk to stamp collectors, academics talk to academics, economists talk to economists and not to anthropologists, and anthropologists to anthropologists and not to economists, and so forth. And to some extent, the internet ought to increase the amount by which that happens, because prior to the internet, you've got all these people who happen to live close to you who you interact with because you come across them. Whereas with the internet, you can spend all your time talking to your fellow economists or fellow anthropologists. So I'm wondering if that would have something like the geographical effect in the opposite direction, where you can see the logic of no point in expanding it. I think it's pretty obvious.
Well, and then the question would be whether stamp collectors talk about something other than stamp collecting.
Yeah, I was thinking of my Usenet experience, really, where back in the Usenet days, one of the nice things about being on a science fiction group, say, was that you were seeing reasonably civil interaction among people with quite a wide range of views. Yeah. So I remember one of those groups, there was a clearly intelligent conservative. I'm a libertarian, so I'm not either conservative or liberal. And once an issue had been argued about there, I was pretty sure I had seen the best arguments for the conservative side. And I could then work on that basis. And the whole issue of sort of how you can expose yourself, not just to a side, but to good arguments for that side, is, it seems to be, one of the important things if you're interested in truth as well as partisanship.
Well, science fiction is a wonderful arena to discuss ideas. I'm not sure stamp collecting, for example, or badminton or many other things are quite as good as science fiction for that.
But I think you will find that the social groups, as it were, are partly created by common interests.
Yes.
And then when you have a social group, you talk about lots of other things. Or even if you don't talk about them, if you know that the people who you think are really great people because of how good they are in your common interest, but oddly enough, they're all conservatives, and I thought I knew all conservatives were stupid. That's going to affect, that's going to create a kind of tolerance, and ditto for the other side, I think. That I think the only person on Facebook whose stuff I read pretty regularly, whose views I know are more or less the opposite of mine, is somebody who I have great respect for through our interaction in historical recreation.
Yeah.
So that would be an example of that effect.
Very nice. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think this ties us back with science fiction potentially as the space, as the safe space for idea exploration that Chris Weber wanted earlier in this conversation. So that would be interesting. All right. Well, we're now at time. I just want to give you perhaps the opportunity in closing off. A, what kind of further research would you be interested that people take on from this? Or B, how can this group very concretely benefit your work? What could we do that would help your work along? Because I think multiple people here are very grateful that you that you address us today, and very interested and eager to engage.
Well, any further ideas you have, either about this particular model or about polarization or problems of democracy more broadly, certainly appreciate.
All right, well then I think for now I will leave it at the hour, and to save your time, thank you so much from every one of us again for joining. Thank you everyone who got up early in Pacific time. I think it was really worth it, and I'll be in contact to try to coordinate potential follow-ups after this call. All right, everyone, thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely start in the day or finish of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, folks.